I thought I was just escaping the noise of the city, until a quiet stranger on the rooftop made everything louder inside me. It started with silence, but what grew between us changed the way I saw everything. And it all began with one shared sunset. The city was loud, even when it tried not to be. Eli had lived there for just under 6 months, but already he could map the constant hum of buses, the stuttering rhythm of crosswalk signals, and the clinking of bottles in alleyways late at night. Still, it was the kind of noise that slowly settled under the skin until it stopped being noise at all. It became presence, like the weight of gravity or the ticking of time. He had moved to the 36th floor of a towering apartment complex downtown. A sleek, modern high-rise with cold marble floors in a lobby and elevators that whispered upward without a sound. He hadn't chosen the place for its prestige or even for its view. It was just available and close to work and had a roof he could access with a keycard. That rooftop had become his sanctuary. It started as a simple escape, a place where he could stare out over the endless sea of lights, sip cheap coffee from a thermos, and feel smaller than the thoughts swirling in his head. The rooftop was always empty. No one seemed to care for it. It had a few benches, some potted plants too dry to be alive, and the gentle hum of rooftop machinery just loud enough to muffle thoughts without forcing him to listen. That silence became important. Eli would visit after work, laptop in hand, pretending to sort photos or answer emails while secretly doing nothing at all. He liked the stillness, the detachment, the rare comfort of not being seen. Up there, the air felt cleaner, cooler, even if that was just his mind playing tricks on him. Sometimes he'd stay for hours, watching as dusk melted into night, as planes blinked slowly across the black sky and the city pulsed below like a living circuit board. Then, one evening, he wasn't alone. It had been a Tuesday, one of those dry, windless evenings where the sky turned gold for an hour before sinking into haze. Eli had taken his usual seat near the ledge, headphones in, staring down at a blank text document. He heard the rooftop door click, a sound he'd never heard up there before. He didn't turn around at first. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and didn't come too close. Whoever it was, they weren't there to talk. Eventually, curiosity won. He glanced over his shoulder and saw a man. Older, early to mid-30s perhaps, with dark, slightly graying hair and a casual, loose posture. He stood a few feet away, near the railing, looking out at the skyline with a kind of practiced stillness. Eli didn't know him, but something about the way the man stood, comfortable but not relaxed, made him seem familiar in a strange way. He didn't speak. Neither of them did. The man stayed for only a few minutes before quietly leaving, never acknowledging Eli's presence. And yet, the stillness he left behind felt different, like a ripple in a calm lake. The next night, Eli returned to the rooftop at the same time. This time, he wasn't surprised when he heard the door click open again. The man returned, same posture, same silence. There was a rhythm forming, though no one acknowledged it. They became silent companions. Eli in his corner with his laptop and headphones, the man at the far edge of the rooftop with his steady, observant presence. He never brought a phone, never fidgeted, just stood and watched the city as if it were telling him something only he could understand. Days turned into weeks. The man became a fixture of Eli's evenings. Eli learned the contours of his routine, noticing that he only came on clear nights, that he always wore the same thin jacket, that he sometimes hummed quietly to himself, just loud enough to be caught in the wind. There was something grounding about him, like the skyline, with a little less overwhelming when he was there. Eli didn't know his name, didn't know his story, but he began to find comfort in the consistency of his presence. In a city that often felt like it had swallowed him whole, this man, this stranger, was a fixed point. He didn't intrude, didn't demand. He was just there. And yet, something in Eli shifted. He started looking forward to the rooftop in a way that had nothing to do with the view. He became aware of how often he checked the time, how his breath slowed when he heard that rooftop door open, how he found himself paying attention to the way the man stood, the way the wind lifted his collar, the way his shoulders relaxed only after long minutes of silence. Something had begun. Quiet, slow, uncertain, but real. The nights began to blur together. The rooftop became more than just a place to escape. For Eli, it turned into a ritual, a quiet habit that gave structure to days otherwise lost in monotony. The skyline never changed, but something inside him had begun to. There was a rhythm now, not dictated by the clock, but by presence, by the knowledge that someone else would be up there too. He still didn't know the man's name, but knowing it didn't feel urgent. What mattered was the way the man showed up, the calm with which he occupied space, and the strange comfort Eli began to draw from that shared silence. Sometimes Eli arrived first. He'd settle on his usual bench, headphones in, but no music playing, pretending to scroll through images on his laptop. He wasn't working. He hadn't edited anything in weeks, but he liked the illusion of productivity. It gave him a reason to sit still, to watch the door, to wait without really waiting. Other times, the man was already there when Eli stepped out onto the rooftop, leaning against the rail with his back to the door, as if he had been there for hours. He always stood in the same spot, left side of the rooftop, near the broken planter box filled with brittle succulents. From there, the view stretched across the river, the distant lights of the bridge casting thin reflections on the dark water. They never spoke, not once, but the silence never felt awkward. It became the language they shared, a kind of quiet agreement that words would only get in the way. And slowly, Eli found himself drawn not only to the presence of the man, but to what that presence made him feel, seen somehow, even without being looked at. As the weeks passed, Eli's thoughts changed. He no longer came to the rooftop simply to breathe or escape the noise of the world below. He came to be near that sense of stillness. He came to feel the quiet closeness of someone who didn't demand explanations. There were moments, fleeting, barely there, when Eli would glance toward the man and catch the smallest shift, a tilt of the head, a faint lift of the corners of his mouth. Once, the man had brought a sketch pad, and Eli watched from the corner of his eye as he slowly moved pencil over paper, completely focused. The lines were strong, deliberate. Eli wanted to ask what he was drawing. He didn't. The man didn't bring the sketch pad again, but that image lingered in Eli's mind. There was a night, a colder one than usual, when the air had a bite to it and the sky was heavy with clouds. Eli hadn't planned on going up to the roof, but something in him refused to stay inside. He wrapped himself in a hoodie and climbed the stairs. He half expected the rooftop to be empty, thinking maybe the other man would skip this time. But he was there. Of course he was. Eli stayed longer than usual that night. The silence between them wasn't just silence anymore. It was a space filled with breath and time and questions neither of them dared to voice. Something hovered in the air, unspoken but real, a growing awareness of each other, of something new forming between them. He found himself noticing things he hadn't before. The curve of the man's shoulders, the way his hands rested against the railing, how his posture shifted slightly when Eli arrived. These small details began to matter. They became signals in the stillness, gestures that held weight. And for the first time, Eli realized he wasn't just drawn to the presence of another person. He was drawn to him, to the quiet strength in his movements, to the way the man seemed so sure of himself and yet carried an unspoken sadness in the corners of his eyes. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was a slow pull from somewhere deeper, something gentle but persistent like a tide. Eli didn't know what it meant. He didn't know what to do with it. But the rooftop, once a space of isolation, had become something more. It was now a place charged with energy, subtle and slow burning. A place where silence carried more weight than words ever could. And Eli felt it every time he climbed the stairs, every time the door clicked open, every time his heart lifted just slightly at the sight of the man already waiting. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew this. The rooftop no longer belonged to him alone, and somehow that made all the difference. There were nights when the air on the rooftop felt different, like it held more weight than before. Eli noticed at the moment he stepped out one Thursday evening. The sky was unusually clear, and the lights of the city below shimmered as if reflected on glass. It was quiet, more than usual, and yet something in that quietness felt thick, like a silence filled with expectation. Marcus was already there. Eli still didn't know his name, but he had started thinking of him that way after glimpsing a piece of mail in the man's hand once. Marcus R. scrawled in neat lettering across the envelope. He never spoke it aloud, never even hinted that he knew. But now the name lived in his thoughts every time he saw the man. Marcus. It fit somehow, solid, grounded, deliberate. Marcus stood in his usual spot, hands resting lightly on the railing, gaze turned toward the skyline. Eli took his place on the bench without a word, pretending again to scroll through files on his laptop. But his attention was scattered, pulled toward the man at the edge of the roof like gravity. The city stretched out endlessly before them, but Eli's focus narrowed to a single point. That evening, something felt different. Marcus hadn't shifted when Eli arrived. Usually, there was some small acknowledgement, a quiet glance, the faint movement of shoulders relaxing. But tonight, he stood utterly still. It wasn't distant exactly. It was concentrated, as if he was waiting for something. Eli sat there longer than usual, the cold of the bench pressing through his jeans. He watched the back of Marcus's figure, the way the wind barely tugged at his jacket. Minutes passed, then more. The silence between them didn't feel companionable. It felt paused, held in place like breath drawn and never exhaled. Eventually, Marcus turned slightly, just enough for Eli to see the side of his face. It was in that moment, brief and barely lit by the glow of the city lights, that something in the air cracked open. Their eyes didn't quite meet, but the near contact sent a wave through Eli's chest. A quiet, sharp awareness that was both terrifying and exhilarating. It wasn't about attraction in the way Eli had understood it before. It wasn't lust, wasn't fantasy. It was presence. The charged awareness that someone else, this someone, occupied space in a way that made the world shift around them. And more than that, this someone had started occupying space inside him. He tried to look away, but he couldn't. The stillness became unbearable, not because it was silent, but because it was full. Something unsaid, something waiting, pulsed between them like the faint beat of music from a distant car stereo. Marcus's shoulders dropped slightly. A breath, maybe. He didn't speak, but he took one small step away from the railing, then turned, just enough so that they stood facing one another across the space of the rooftop. Not close, not intimate, but no longer apart. Eli's throat tightened. His fingers curled over the edge of the bench. He didn't move. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure it could be heard above the soft hum of the rooftop vents. He wasn't sure what was happening. All he knew was that the silence between them was no longer neutral. It was charged. There was no smile, no gesture of welcome, just a long, quiet moment where everything that had been quietly building now hovered between them. Uncertain, unnamed, but undeniably real. The wind shifted. Eli stood, slowly, almost without realizing it. He took a step forward, then stopped. The distance between them was still wide. Too wide for anything to be declared, but just close enough for something to be acknowledged. He looked at Marcus and waited. For what? He didn't know. A sign? Permission? An answer to a question he hadn't spoken? Marcus's gaze held his for a breath too long. Then he turned back toward the city, quietly resuming his usual posture, shoulders straight, eyes on the horizon. But the shift had already happened. The silence had been broken, even if no words were used. Eli sat back down, pulse still racing. He didn't understand what had just occurred. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't obvious. No touches, no words. But something between them had cracked open, like a seam gently pulled apart to let something vulnerable breathe. That night, when Eli returned to his apartment, he didn't turn on any lights. He stood by the window, staring out at the rooftop he had just left. The space now felt different in his mind, charged with something fragile, something blooming. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew that the silence had changed. And so had he. The weather changed before anyone could really prepare for it. The sky darkened slowly, the kind of heavy gray that swallowed the light by mid-afternoon. Eli had been watching the clouds build all day through his office window, unsure why the idea of missing the rooftop that evening unsettled him so much. It was just a routine, he told himself. A ritual. But deep down, He knew it wasn't true anymore. That night, despite the looming storm, he found himself walking toward the stairwell instead of the elevator. Something in his chest buzzed with quiet urgency, a pull he couldn't explain. By the time he reached the rooftop door, the first drops of rain had already begun to fall, slow, cold, and deliberate. He pushed the door open anyway. The air was thick with electricity, not yet thunder, but full of its promise. The rooftop was empty at first glance. The benches glistened with moisture, and the wind carried the scent of asphalt and distant lightning. Eli stepped forward, hesitating near the wall, wondering if maybe this was the night the rhythm would finally break. But then he saw him. Marcus stood under the narrow overhang near the maintenance shed, dry but surrounded by the encroaching rain. His hands were tucked in his pockets, posture calm, eyes already turned toward Eli. It felt different, even before Eli had moved, like something had already been decided. Eli stepped beneath the overhang, a careful distance between them. The rain intensified, turning the rooftop into a stage of sound. Sharp patters on metal, splashes on the concrete, the occasional rumble from the clouds above. They stood side by side in the shelter of the building, neither speaking. But this time, the silence didn't mask anything. It revealed it. Eli could feel his heartbeat in his fingertips. They stayed like that for what felt like a long time. Marcus didn't turn away. He watched the skyline as if trying to memorize it. Eli noticed the slight rise and fall of his chest, the gentle tension in his jaw. And for the first time, he realized Marcus wasn't calm. He was just good at hiding it. The rain blurred the city lights, softening the edges of everything. It felt surreal, like the world had been placed under glass. Eli wasn't sure who moved first. Maybe it was him, but the space between them slowly began to dissolve. A few inches closer, then a few more. Not touching, not yet, but close enough for the warmth of Marcus's body to cut through the damp air. Eli's mind raced, but his body remained still. Something told him that if he spoke, the moment would shatter. Whatever had been building between them over the past weeks was now trembling just beneath the surface. It wasn't something physical. It was a tension of awareness, of quiet longing, of recognition. He thought of the way Marcus had looked at him a few nights ago, when their eyes had almost met. He thought of the silence that followed, the way neither of them had run. Now, in the closeness of this shared shelter, Eli could feel it more clearly than ever. This wasn't a passing fascination. It wasn't confusion. It was something real. And then, without ceremony, without words, Marcus turned toward him. The moment was soft, not sudden, like a shift in the wind. His eyes met Eli's, and there was no longer any space left between them to pretend. Eli saw something in that gaze, uncertainty, yes, but also honesty. There was no performance here, no calculation, just two people who had found something unexpected in a world too often ruled by noise. Eli didn't look away. The rain continued its rhythm, a steady heartbeat surrounding them. Marcus's hand moved slightly, not reaching, just lifting in the air, as if uncertain whether the space between them was meant to be crossed. But Eli didn't step back. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, his breath shallow, his skin tingling with the nearness of something that felt both frightening and necessary. It wasn't about labels or roles or definitions. It wasn't even about desire, not entirely. It was about being seen, clearly, without disguise, and not turning away. Something in Marcus's face softened. The smallest trace of a smile, not playful, but relieved. As if whatever question he had been carrying inside him had finally found an answer. They didn't kiss. They didn't touch. The tension remained unresolved, suspended in the charged air around them. But they both knew. Whatever had been quietly forming in the shadows now stood in the light. When the thunder finally cracked overhead, it startled neither of them. They stayed there a little longer, shoulder to shoulder, breath to breath, watching the city blur beneath the rain. And in the stillness, Eli understood that something had begun. Not with a kiss, not with a confession, but with a moment of mutual truth. The rain lasted until dawn. Eli hadn't planned to stay up that long. He hadn't meant to linger in that narrow space beneath the rooftop overhang until the sky began to soften from black to blue. But leaving never felt like an option. not after what had passed between them in silence. When Marcus finally stepped back, it was slow, careful, like he was afraid to disturb whatever fragile understanding had settled between them. He didn't say anything. Neither did Eli. Words would have felt too heavy, too sudden. Instead, they had returned inside without a glance, walking down separate stairwells towards separate doors, and Eli had gone home with his clothes damp from the mist, his skin humming with memory. Now, in the pale light of morning, Eli stood at his window. The city had resumed its endless rhythm. Buses grumbled below, neon signs blinked half-heartedly, and the voices of early risers spilled out from a cafe across the street. But none of it touched him. The rooftop lived in a different register of time, a slower one, a quieter one. He hadn't slept. His thoughts refused to settle. It wasn't that something dramatic had happened. There had been no grand declarations, no tangled limbs or whispered confessions. But Eli knew in the stillness of his chest, in the slow pull beneath his ribs, that the world had shifted slightly, that he had shifted. The rooftop wasn't just a place anymore. It had become a memory, etched now with the shape of another person, not defined by what was said or done, but by what had been allowed to exist there, the pause, the recognition, the slow forming of something new. He wondered if Marcus felt it too. The thought of him brought a quiet warmth to Eli's chest, followed almost immediately by a flicker of uncertainty. They had crossed into a space that didn't have a clear name, a space full of questions, and Eli didn't know how to answer any of them yet. But he didn't feel lost. For the first time in a long while, he felt anchored, not by certainty, but by presence, by the knowledge that something had been seen and accepted, that something had changed, not because it had to, but because it was ready. He returned to the rooftop that evening. The air was cooler, the sky clearer, as if the storm had swept away more than just humidity. He found himself noticing every detail, the rust along the railing, the way the setting sun cast a thin gold ribbon across the buildings, the distant sounds of music spilling from someone's window far below. It all felt sharper, more awake. Marcus wasn't there yet. Eli sat on the usual bench, arms crossed, his foot tapping slowly on the concrete. He didn't know if Marcus would come. There was no rule, no agreement, just the quiet hope that the rhythm they'd shared still existed, even after what had passed. And then, there he was. The rooftop door opened with its soft, familiar click. Marcus stepped out into the open air, the golden light of dusk casting shadows across his face. He didn't hesitate this time. He walked toward Eli, not too quickly, not too carefully, just with purpose. He sat beside him, close, closer than usual. No words, no explanations, just that quiet presence again, side by side, looking out over the same view that had watched them both change. Eli didn't need to ask if Marcus remembered the night before. It was in the way his arm rested just slightly against Eli's, in the way his gaze lingered on the horizon for only a second before shifting, not to the city, but to him. And for once, Eli didn't look away. They sat there for a long time. The sun dipped lower, and the lights of the city blinked on one by one like stars surfacing from beneath the earth. The moment didn't demand anything. It simply existed, gently expanding between them. Eli found himself breathing slower, deeper. He thought of all the nights he had sat here alone, unaware of what was coming, of how silence had once been a way to hide, and now it was the place where something real had grown. Whatever was between them, it was quiet. It was careful. It was just beginning. But it was theirs, and that was enough.